Good morning. Back into our midweek Bible study we are. Chapter 14 of the Gospel of Mark. We're going to be looking today at the actual arrest of Jesus, his betrayal and arrest. It is coming to a part of all of the Gospel accounts that, for me at least, becomes increasingly difficult to talk about. As I think about what Jesus went through, for me, it has an impact on me every time I do this. And I think it should on you as well. The idea that our God, our Creator, would come to this earth in human form just to identify with us in the way that he has is powerful. And then, on top of that, to think of everything that he goes through, from the betrayal and the arrest and the trials and the tremendous physical trauma of the execution, combined with the emotional and spiritual trauma of becoming sin for us. To me, it just blows my mind every time I go through this. And so this is really the beginning of it. As we start this in Mark's Gospel, chapter 14, starting at verse 43, we'll go down through verse 52 today. Let me read this to you. We'll have a word of prayer and we'll begin. And immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him and hold him and lead him away under guard." And when he came, he went up to him at once and said, "Rabbi," and he kissed him. And they laid hands on him and seized him. But one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus said to them, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled." And they all left him and fled. And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body. And they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. Father, we come to you. This is a terrible moment in the history of humanity. The outright open betrayal of our God by one of his closest friends. Hard to understand, Lord, hard to deal with. And so today, as we look at this, help us, Father, to better understand and to grasp what's happening, why it's happening, and Lord, perhaps even how it ought to impact us today. We give you thanks for this time now, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen. And so here we are. Immediately while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. So we pick up this account as Jesus is speaking his last words to his disciples. Remember what he said. Just in verse 42, he said, "Rise, for my betrayer is at hand." As Jesus was speaking, it was evident Judas was right then approaching, close enough that he could be recognized, and accompanying him was this crowd. Some of the translations say a great multitude. In other words, this was not a few men. This was perhaps as many as 100 people that were following after Judas. Mark makes it a point to identify Judas as the betrayer and to identify him as one of the 12. And remember, these 12 men had been with Jesus through the vast majority of his public ministry. I mean, obviously there was a timeline of how he called the 12, and we don't know where Judas fits in exactly, but Judas had certainly been a witness to nearly all of what Jesus had done publicly. He had heard nearly everything that Jesus had taught, and He had certainly seen people healed, demons cast out, even people raised from the dead. And so it's hard to meld these two concepts of this man who had walked with Jesus, slept in the same room or same boat as Jesus, eaten meals with him, heard him teach, watched him in action, and yet still he would betray him. And many people have tried to speculate about the motives of Judas. And we have to remember that all that is speculation. We just don't know what motivated Judas to do what he did. We just know he chose to do it. Along with Judas, it says, came a crowd, a significant number of people. They were armed, it says, with swords and with clubs. They came from, it says, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now, the Romans allowed the Sanhedrin to keep a security force, temple police or temple guards, if you will. And many in this crowd were probably from that group of men. According to John's account, there may have even been some Roman soldiers attached to this group. Verse 44, now the betrayer had given them a sign saying, the one I kiss is the man. Seize him and lead him away under guard. And when he came, he went up to him at once and said, Rabbi, and kissed him. So Judas had made prior arrangements with the men that he was leading out there into the Garden of Gethsemane. He would kiss the man that they were to arrest. And obviously it was still somewhat dark at this time. We presume this is probably somewhere around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. So a means of positively identifying Jesus amongst all the men that would be gathered there had to be provided, and this was the method. Now, a kiss of greeting was not uncommon in that culture at that time. It's still not uncommon amongst some cultures in the Middle East, even for men to kiss each other on the cheek as a form of greeting. And this may have been that kind of kiss where he would kiss him on the cheek. That's usually reserved for close, intimate friends and family. It may have also been a kiss upon the hand. It was not atypical or untypical for a student to kiss the hand of their rabbi, their master, as a form of acknowledgement and greeting. Regardless of whether it was a kiss on the cheek, a kiss on the hand, the arrangement was simple. The man Judas said he would kiss is the man that they were to arrest. They were to seize him and take him away, it says. And that idea of seizing him is key here. And so Judas perfectly keeps his part of the bargain. He comes up to him at once and says, Rabbi, and greets him with a kiss. Verse 46, and they laid hands on him and seized him. The armed force sent to arrest Jesus also does their part. They laid hands on Jesus. Literally, they grabbed hold of him. I've watched plenty of arrests being made. When I served as a chaplain for the local police department here, I was present numerous times when people were being arrested. And there is a sense of, that authoritative grip upon somebody's body that lets you know you're now no longer free to move and to act as you were. And that word seize does impart the idea of being taken into custody under the authority of somebody else. At this point, truly, Jesus is no longer free to move. He is under the control of the Sanhedrin and the temple guards. He is under arrest. He has been betrayed by one of his closest friends, and now he is under arrest. But just because all this has happened doesn't mean that the disciples aren't free to react. And so we read verse 47, but one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Now Mark's gospel just gives this bare, statement. One of the disciples drew his sword, swung it, struck off the ear of one of the men, the servant of the high priest. That's all that Mark's gospel tells us. The other gospels fill in a few more details. We know from the other gospel accounts that the attacker in this case, the one who stood by and drew his sword, was Peter. Perhaps not surprising. Peter always seemed to be the one most bold to speak out. And here he is, drawing his sword, apparently trying to defend Jesus. And he swings it, and whether the man ducked or Peter just wasn't all that well versed in the use of a sword, he does not exactly deliver a mortal blow. He slices off the man's ear. We also know from the other gospel accounts that the name of the man was Malchus, the servant of the high priest. So we know more than just what Mark says. One standing by drew his sword and struck and cut off the ear. Peter drew his sword, swung it, and struck and hit a man named Malchus and cut off his ear. We also know from the other accounts that Jesus healed Malchus on the spot and settled down the entire resistance. Peter did seem willing to fight at this point, but that was not part of the plan. And even though at least one other disciple had a sword, we know from the other accounts that at least 2 swords were present among the disciples. This was not going to be a battle. This was not going to be a fight. There would be no more bloodshed by anybody but Jesus. And so Jesus submits to the arrest, but even in his submission to the arrest, he does call out those who have come to arrest him. Verses 48 and 49, and Jesus said to them, "Have you come out as against a robber, with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled." So Jesus, after quelling the fight that Peter tried to start, turns to those arresting him, and he asks them a question. "Have you come out as against a robber, with swords and clubs to capture me?" The manner in which they are arresting him, Jesus calls out. He asks them really, literally, about the size of the force and the fact that they were, for their day, very heavily armed, as if they were arresting a violent criminal. The word robber in this case does translate into the idea of a highwayman, not somebody who not like a sneak thief who breaks into your house and steals, or a pickpocket or something like that. But literally a robber is a man who would be willing to use violence in the furtherance of their own criminal enterprise. And Jesus says, "If you come out to arrest me as if I were a robber, as if I were a violent criminal, you have to have all these swords and clubs with which to arrest me?" I mean, what was Jesus guilty of? Teaching quietly in the temple? Healing? Showing compassion? I mean, the worst thing he did was he did drive out the money changers, admittedly, but it's not like he was constantly trying to rise up, a crowd and incite civil unrest or something. He wasn't a violent criminal, and yet that's how they've come to arrest him. And the timing of the arrest is also called out by Jesus. Jesus had been in the temple area teaching every day that week. If they wanted to arrest him, why not do so then? Well, he was easily found. He wasn't creating public disturbances, but he was right there. If you wanted to arrest him, come on, you could have arrested me right there, he's saying. But as he says, let the scriptures be fulfilled. And perhaps he's referring to Isaiah chapter 53 at this point. In verse 12, in fact, of Isaiah 53 says, "Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors." I mean, Jesus obviously was treated as a criminal with his execution, with his crucifixion. But even beginning here with his arrest, he's being treated as a criminal. They come out with a large force. with swords and clubs to arrest him. It would be like, and not that I'm Jesus, certainly, and I'm not trying to say that, but it would be like if the police thought I was guilty of some minor crime, non-violent crime, and they ordered up the full SWAT team, helicopter hovering overhead, tear gas, shields, bulletproof vests, and everything to come and arrest me. Probably a little overkill, don't you think? And that's kind of what Jesus is telling all of these men. Kind of a little overkill, don't you think? You could have taken me any day when I was in the temple. But you choose the cowardly way of coming at night when nobody else is around, coming heavily armed, so heavily armed that it would be foolish to attempt to overcome you by force. And at this point, with Jesus' full submission to the arrest probably being very evident now, we come to verses 50 through 52. And they all left him and fled. And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. The first statement is just a bare explanation. They all left him and fled. The disciples lose their will to fight. Despite all of their earlier protestations, they bolt. They flee. Whether they were running or walking quickly or hiding behind trees and, whatever it was obvious that there was no more fight left in the disciples. They were done for. Mark's account lacks any further details, possibly trying to limit the embarrassment of the disciples. I mean, this is not a high point in their lives. However, Mark's account, and this is found only in Mark's gospel, includes mention of a young man following. And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body. And they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. Many scholars believe, and this is supposition, but I think there's some solid supposition here. Many scholars believe that this young man may well have been Mark. It was not uncommon for writers of the time to refer to themselves in this way without using their own name. And certainly, Mark himself would not have been proud of exactly how this all turned out. And if this is indeed Mark, it would perhaps lend some credence to the supposition that the Last Supper took place in Mark's own house. Mark would have been a young man there, probably still living in the household of his father. Again, that's all conjecture to some degree, but a young man followed him, it says, with nothing but a linen cloth about his body. Perhaps the departure of Jesus and his disciples earlier had awoken Mark, and not being able to gather his clothing right away, rather than trying to do that, he simply kind of grabbed a linen bed sheet and wrapped it around himself as a cloak and went out and followed. And when the men who had come to arrest Jesus started leading Jesus away, Mark, or this young man, started to follow after. He was the only one who tried to continue to follow. Again, whether it's Mark or not is not conclusive, but what is recorded is that this young man did try to go after him. And some of those who were responsible for arresting Jesus noted this. And so they tried to seize him too. It's like, oh, you want to follow along? Fine, you're under arrest also. But as they reach out to grab him, all they get a hold of is the linen cloth that's around him. And it says he ran away naked. Now, the word used here for naked doesn't necessarily mean that it was completely unclothed. It could have also meant that he was severely underdressed. In other words, he may well have still had on that inner private garment that they would never take off publicly. And he would have had the bed sheet around him. So they grabbed the bed sheet, so all he's left with is basically his underwear. Regardless of that, verse 52 concludes the arrest. And the point of 50, 51, and 52, they all left him and fled. Even this young man who perhaps had been awoken when they left the home with the Last Supper and it was following along, felt it necessary to drop everything and run. The absolute betrayal by Judas has been completed. All of the disciples have fled. Even this young man who was following, leaving Jesus to face the remainder of this day without the support of his closest friends. Again, as I said, I have a hard time going through this without being impacted by the account. How isolated must Jesus have felt? Even though he knew it was going to happen. He had predicted it, remember. It still would have been a very, very difficult, emotional time for Jesus. And in one sense at least, we'll get to it next week, but in one sense at least, this isn't the worst moment that is yet to come. So, what do we take from this? Well, as I mentioned before, when we talked about Jesus predicting that they would all run away, we have to be careful not to judge too harshly the disciples. No one truly knows how they're going to respond to an imminently dangerous situation until the moment arrives and they are forced to choose. There but for the grace of God go I. I might well have been like Peter, rash, brash, pulling a sword out and swinging it without regard and hurting somebody but doing no real good. And then moments later, running away. Or I might have been one of the other disciples, perhaps cowering back, seeking to get out of the limelight. Certainly these men came bearing torches. So there would have been a circle of light there. Maybe I was the one hiding behind a tree, hoping nobody would see me. All I know is that today, every day, I get to make a choice about how I maintain my loyalty, my commitment to being a disciple of Jesus, whenever I come in contact with someone who doesn't know him. Am I going to cower behind the tree? Am I going to be rash and brash and then run away? Or will I stand firm? Don't be too harsh in judging the disciples and the fact that they ran away, because I'm afraid too often we do also. So, next week we'll get into the first of the trials of Jesus and some of the worst moments that Jesus had to experience. Father, thank you. Thank you for sending your Son. Jesus, thank you for coming to this earth. Even though you had to endure some of the most horrific, heinous punishment, physical torture, mental anguish, spiritual battles on our behalf, none of which you had to endure but you willingly submitted your will to the Father to endure it for our sake. You were numbered among the transgressors, and yet without sin. You took our punishment and forgave, and continue to forgive today. So help us, Lord, to be forgiving. Help us, Lord, to stand even when things start getting difficult. Help us, Lord, to be the disciples you designed us to be. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you. I hope to see you next week.